I am that woman who was constantly abused by my own father. He forced me into intimate relations and held me captive. In total, I gave birth to 14 of his children, although not all of them survived.
With these words, Alba Nidia Álvarez summed up the story of her tragic life. I want to say that the case we are going to talk about today has become one of the most high-profile and horrific in the history of Colombia. When my colleagues told me about this case, I was shocked by the scale and duration of the crimes committed against this woman. Despite all the difficulties and trials that the victim faced, she demonstrated incredible strength of spirit and will to live. Alba Nidia not only managed to break free from the clutches of her tormentor, but also built a new life for herself and her children. This is a striking example of resilience and the indomitable human spirit. This story is a reminder to all of us that domestic violence and intimate crimes against women and children, unfortunately, still remain widespread problems in our society. Little is known about the early years of Arcedio Álvarez's life. The only thing that has been ascertained is that on the eve of his coming of age, he entered into a relationship with a young woman who later gave birth to his daughter. Unfortunately, Arcedio's common-law wife passed away prematurely in 1979, leaving a 5-year-old girl without a mother. The child was named Alba Nidia Álvarez, but over time, a more concise name stuck with her Nidi. Losing a parent at such an early age can have a serious impact on a child's psychological state and development, especially if the remaining parent is unable to provide proper care and support. It seems that this is exactly what happened in Nidi's situation. Shortly after his wife's death, Arcedio decided to move with his daughter to his relatives, hoping for their help in raising the girl. However, problems related to the man's harsh treatment of his daughter began to arise quite quickly in the new place. As a rule, his behavior went far beyond the usual strictness of a father or frequent outbursts of anger. But let's not jump to conclusions, because this is just the tip of the iceberg in this horrifying story. But before I tell you more, I ask you to subscribe to the channel right now, like this video, and leave any comment below so that as many people as possible can watch this video. The horrifying truth about the Álvarez family began to unfold when Nidi was only 13 years old. It was at this age that she gave birth to her first child, who by a terrible coincidence was also her brother. It's not hard to imagine what a shock and tragedy this must have been for the young girl. However, her father Arcedio seemed not at all concerned about his daughter's feelings and suffering. On the contrary, there is reason to believe that he was even happy about the baby's arrival, as he himself was the father. It's hard to imagine what can push a biological father to such cruel and unnatural treatment of his own child. Shortly after the birth of Nidi's first child, Arcedio decides to move the family to the small municipality of Mariquita, known as the fruit capital of Colombia. But even this picturesque town did not become a real home for them. Eventually, they settled in the small village of Vereda la Cabaña, where no more than 200 families lived. Arcedio, like most locals, made a living from farming, but his income was barely enough to support the family. So the Álvarez family had to settle in a dilapidated house that could hardly be called a cozy nest. At that time, Arcedio already had 4 children from his elder daughter, but strangely enough, this fact did not arouse particular suspicion among the local residents. They perceived the Álvarez family as an ordinary family where a single father was raising children. Of course, from the outside, the Álvarez family could seem prosperous. They did not communicate much with their neighbors, and Nidi herself was a very withdrawn girl who hardly spoke to anyone except her father and her children. She practically never left the house alone, and if she did go out, it was usually accompanied by Arcedio. Perhaps it was the presence of her father that made her keep silent about the horrors that were happening behind the closed doors of their home. The villagers rarely saw Nidi, except when she came to the local market with her father to do some shopping. The more attentive of them noticed that the girl, despite her young age, did not attend school. But unfortunately, no one dared to ask her or her father why she was not getting an education like all the other children. Over time, the truth about the horrific events that were taking place behind the closed doors of the Álvarez family's house began to surface. The turning point came when Nidi became pregnant again. In this situation, you didn't need to be a genius to put the facts together and conclude who the real father of the child was. After all, as I mentioned earlier, the girl practically never left the house. She had no boyfriend or friends, and her every move was controlled by her despotic father. So there was only one logical explanation. The father of Nidi's children was none other than Arcedio himself. The most shocking and outrageous thing about this situation is that even though it became obvious to everyone around that Nidi's father was committing terrible crimes against his daughter, no one dared to go to the law enforcement authorities. Instead, the neighbors and acquaintances of the Alvarez family turned into silent witnesses of the systematic violence against a minor girl. As it turned out later, during more than 20 years of inhuman abuse, Nidia endured at least 11 pregnancies from her rapist father. Unfortunately, not all the children born as a result of the violence survived. Several infants were born prematurely and died shortly after birth. It is worth noting that Nidia never gave birth in a hospital under the supervision of qualified doctors. In fact, she was completely deprived of any medical assistance. In the end, out of the 14 children born to Nidia, only 8 survived, 3 boys and 5 girls. It is noteworthy that among all of Arcedio's children, only his elder daughter Nidia had more or less decent reading and writing skills. It turns out that the tyrant father decided to personally teach her literacy, while the rest of the children were completely deprived of even a basic education. In fact, from the moment of birth, the rights of these children were violated in the most horrific way. They virtually did not exist for the state and society. They had no documents, neither birth certificates nor medical records. They were never taken to kindergarten or school and were not even given the necessary vaccinations. What can we say? These children never even crossed the threshold of an ordinary clinic. The most outrageous thing in this story is the reaction, or rather the lack thereof, from the local community. Instead of extending a helping hand to the defenseless girl, the neighbors chose to openly condemn Nidia, accusing her of allegedly voluntarily engaging in sexual relations with her own father. No one even thought about the fact that a child who had been a victim of slavery from an early age had virtually no choice. It is not surprising that Nidia did not react in any way to the constant insults and humiliation from those around her. For years, enduring inhuman treatment from her father, she got used to silently enduring any abuse. Arcedio had subjugated his daughter's will to such an extent that she could not even think of contradicting him, let alone condemning his criminal actions. Friends, a very important point in creating such content requires a lot of time, and now my channel and I are going through a not very good financial situation. I will be immensely grateful to you if you become a sponsor of this channel and support me with your donation. And in return, I will be able to personally respond to you in the comments and also be able to mention your noble name in my video. Therefore, become sponsors. I will be immensely grateful to you. Thank you for your attention. Let's continue. Despite all the alarming signals, the neighbors of the Alvarez family for some reason continue to consider Arcedio a strict but decent man. Perhaps his authoritarianism and cruelty were perceived as an integral part of the image of the head of the family in the eyes of the local residents. In reality, the villagers were simply afraid of Arcedio and what he was capable of. They feared becoming victims of his aggression and revenge if they dared to intervene or report their suspicions. Over the years, the violence between father and daughter turned into a kind of open secret in their small village. Everyone around knew or guessed what was happening behind the closed doors of the Alvarez house, but they preferred to remain silent and not interfere. This tacit conspiracy actually allowed Arcedio to continue his crimes without fear of exposure or punishment. Sometimes representatives of local authorities and the church visited the Alvarez home. They allegedly cared about the fate of the children and tried to convince Arcedio to let them go to school so that they could get an education and grow up to be normal people. But all these visits had no real effect. The tyrant father continued to keep his children in complete isolation from the outside world. The most striking thing about this situation is that even the representatives of the authorities and social services who visited the Alvarez house did not pay attention to the obvious signs of slavery and violence. They did not attach importance to the fact that the children did not even have birth certificates and did not actually exist for the state. What can we say about the rights and interests of the child when everyone around turned a blind eye to the very existence of these children? It seemed that Arcedio was under some powerful protection, and neither the authorities nor the community wanted to interfere with his criminal actions. If this silence and inaction had continued, Nidia and her children would never have escaped from the hell in which they had been forced to exist for so many years. But there came a moment when even the hardened Nidia could no longer endure her father's abuse. The last straw was when Arcedio, having cooled off towards his elder daughter, turned his lustful attention to one of the younger girls. Moreover, he began to encourage and force his sons to do the same thing that he himself had been doing for years, to assault their sisters. Many may say that at the moment of greatest despair, when it seemed that nothing could stop Arcedio's atrocities, it was a higher power that intervened and gave Nidia a chance for salvation. This savior was Orlando de Marin, the pastor of the local Pentecostal church. As part of his spiritual mission, he often visited remote villages and towns to spread the word of God and help the needy. During one of these visits, Orlando heard the horrifying story of Nidia and her suffering at the hands of her own father. This became a fateful moment for the tormented woman. For the first time in many years, she felt that she had found a person she could trust and who was ready to support her. Nidia opened up to the pastor and told him the whole truth about her hellish life, not hiding even the most terrible details. After listening to Nidia's confession, Orlando began to insist that she immediately take the children and run away from the tyrant's house. But even with the support of a spiritual mentor, it was incredibly difficult for the woman to take this step. Years of cruel oppression and humiliation by her father had taken their toll. Nidia had virtually forgotten how to make independent decisions and stand up for her rights. All she knew was submission and fear of her despot father, who had instilled in her from early childhood that she was worthless and completely dependent on his will. But despite all the fear and uncertainty in Nidia's soul, there glimmered a spark of hope for a better life for herself and her children. And this spark eventually grew into a determination to confront the monster who had ruined her childhood and youth. It was at this time that the world community was shocked by another horrific case, the story of Elisabeth Fritzl from Austria. Elisabeth's father, Joseph Fritzl, had kept his daughter in captivity for 24 years, raping her and forcing her to bear his children. This case gained wide publicity and caused a wave of outrage and sympathy around the world. When Nidia heard about Elisabeth's suffering, she saw in it a reflection of her own fate. The realization that she was not the only victim of such a terrible crime, to some extent, gave her strength and determination. The woman realized that if she did not dare to escape now, her father would never stop and would continue to abuse not only her but also her children. The thought that her own daughters might repeat her tragic fate and become victims of their sick grandfather filled Nidia with both horror and rage. At that moment, the maternal instinct overcame years of fear, and the woman decided to protect her children at all costs from the monster they were forced to call their father and grandfather. So, gathering her courage for the last time, Nidia challenged her tormentor. It was a bold and desperate step for a woman who had endured beatings and humiliation for years for the slightest fault or disobedience. Arcedio, who was used to intimidating and using force to keep his children in submission, was puzzled by his daughter's unexpected resistance. Fleeing from the domestic tyrant, Nidia had to make a difficult decision to leave behind her two elder sons who had decided to stay with their father. It is hard to judge what motivated these young men when they chose the side of the abuser. Perhaps, having observed lawlessness and violence in the family for years, they themselves embarked on the path of moral degeneration. Or maybe their fear of their father was stronger than their love and compassion for their mother and sisters. Be that as it may, Nidia and her children who dared to escape headed to the city of Maracaibo, hoping to find shelter and justice there. Once in safety, Nidia dared for the first time in many years to openly accuse her father of the crimes he had committed. She went to the law enforcement authorities with an official complaint, describing in detail all the abuse and violence she had endured since childhood. At first, the woman limited herself to accusations of beatings, fearing to reveal the whole truth about the intimate assaults. But just a few days later, with the support of representatives from the Ministry of Family Affairs, she found the strength to tell about the years of crimes against her sexual inviolability. It is clear that in order to bring criminal charges against Arcedio, the investigators needed to verify Nidia's testimony and find evidence to support her words. Unfortunately, such investigations rarely happen quickly, especially when it comes to such delicate and shocking crimes as years of violence. The investigators needed time to gather testimony, conduct examinations, and interrogate witnesses. But time was the very resource that Nidia and her children were catastrophically short of. Finding themselves in a strange city without a roof over their heads and means of subsistence, Nidia's family was forced to rent housing. Their meager savings were melting before their eyes, and the prospect of ending up on the street was becoming more and more real. To support herself and her children, Nidia had to urgently look for a job, and this despite the fact that she had never had a permanent income and had not received a proper education because of her despotic father. But maternal love and despair work miracles. Nidia managed to get a job in one of the local restaurants. The work was exhausting, 15 hours a day, but the woman understood that this was the only chance to provide her children with a roof over their heads and food. She steadfastly endured all the hardships, hoping that soon justice would finally prevail and her former abuser would receive his well-deserved punishment. But the Colombian investigative authorities seemed in no hurry to investigate Nidia's case. Despite the seriousness and obviousness of Arcedio's crimes, law enforcement did not take decisive measures to bring him to justice. It seemed that the police and the prosecutor's office simply did not take Nidia's testimony seriously and did not want to get their hands dirty with such a scandalous and tangled investigation. Nidia did not have to fight for justice for her family alone. Representatives of the Ministry of Family Affairs came to her defense, who were able to draw the attention of the public and the media to this horrific case. Thanks to the activity of these caring people, Nidi's story gained wide publicity, becoming one of the most high-profile criminal cases in the country. After months of gathering evidence and testimony, in January 2009, the investigation finally concluded that there was enough material to formally charge Arcedio Álvarez Quintero. The country's prosecutor's office, realizing the seriousness and resonance of this case, ordered the most complete and thorough investigation of all episodes of this man's criminal activity. Fortunately, in Nidi's case, justice finally got off the ground. Already in March 2009, employees of the Special Unit for Criminal Investigations conducted a lightning-fast operation to detain Arcedio. In just a few hours, they tracked down and captured this tyrant on a sugar cane plantation where he had been hiding recently. Finally, the monster who had abused his daughter and grandchildren for so many years was in the hands of justice. But even after being arrested, Arcedio did not stop trying to justify himself and avoid punishment. In his first testimony, he claimed that he had never forced Nidia into intimacy and that their relationship was voluntary. Moreover, he stated that Nidia was not his biological daughter at all, but had been adopted at an early age. So all the accusations of violence were allegedly a misunderstanding and an attempt to tarnish his good name. Of course, these pathetic attempts to justify himself caused only anger and indignation. After all, the facts and results of the examinations clearly indicated that Nidia was indeed Arcedio's biological daughter. And the story about adoption is just a cynical fabrication designed to downplay the gravity of what he had done. When Nidia was told about her father's testimony, she was shocked and enraged by his lies. According to her, Arcedio deliberately used the legend of adoption to justify years of violence and prove that technically he was not guilty of crimes. The woman bitterly recalled how her father had subjected her to cruel beatings, humiliated her and terrorized her, in fact holding her captive in her own home for years. But despite all the suffering and pain that Nidia had to endure, she confessed that she still considered Arcedio her father and even had conflicting feelings for him, similar to love. The woman said that for a long time she had tried to reach his conscience, begging him to stop the abuse, but he remained deaf to her pleas. From a psychological point of view, such complex and ambiguous feelings of a victim towards her abuser are not uncommon. After all, from early childhood, Nidia knew no other life than the hell in which she was forced to exist. In her distorted coordinate system, her father, despite all his cruelty, remained the only close and dear man, and his tyranny and violence became something mundane and normal for the girl. At the end of March 2009, the first court hearing in the case of Arcedio Álvarez Quintero took place. And as often happens with psychopaths and sociopaths, the defendant continued to insist on his distorted version of events. Despite the obvious facts and evidence, he claimed that Nidia was not his biological daughter, but had been adopted at an early age. Moreover, Arcedio had the audacity to state that he and the girl had allegedly agreed to love each other, and all their intimate contacts took place solely by mutual consent. Of course, these absurd and cynical statements caused real shock and indignation in the courtroom. After all, according to Nidia herself, the violence by her father began when she was only 5 years old. So what mutual consent can we talk about when this monster was raping a defenseless child? During cross-examination, Arcedio was unable to explain how he could even think of talking about an agreement with his own underage daughter. His illogical and false testimony once again proved that we are dealing with a pathological liar and manipulator who feels no remorse for the crimes he committed. Based on the results of the first court hearing, Arcedio was placed in a local pre-trial detention center. When he was brought out of the courthouse, an enraged crowd rushed towards him. Hundreds of outraged citizens who had come to support Nidia demanded mob justice against her abuser. And if it were not for the intervention of the police, who knows how it would have ended for this inhuman monster. The public resonance around the Álvarez family case was truly insane. All national media, from newspapers to TV channels, covered the court proceedings day after day. The country froze in anticipation of the verdict for the monster of Mariquita, as journalists dubbed Arcedio. And I must admit honestly, I do not remember ever encountering such a level of public hatred and contempt for a defendant in my many years of career. It seemed that Arcedio had become the embodiment of absolute evil for the whole country, and his new nickname, the Monster of Mariquita, most accurately reflected the essence of this vile man. And only Nidia, it seemed, retained a crumb of compassion for her executioner. For the first time in many years, this exhausted woman felt safe and was able to openly tell the world about the suffering she had endured. Although she did it extremely briefly and reluctantly, because the memories of years of violence were too painful. But despite all the horror that befell her, Nidia, amazed with her resilience and strength of spirit. Communicating with journalists, she repeated that she was most afraid of losing her children. Nidia confessed that she could not imagine her life without them, and was most afraid that her father would harm them in the same way he had once harmed her. The trial of Arcedio Álvarez Quintero, better known as the Monster of Mariquita, took place in 2009. It is worth noting that this trial was surprisingly quick and dynamic, as if all branches of government had finally united and decided to put an end to this horrific story as soon as possible. Unfortunately, over time, many details of the trial itself have been lost or destroyed, but some key points have still been reconstructed. The main and in fact the only prosecution witness at the trial was Nidia herself, the victim of years of violence by her father. This fragile but incredibly brave woman found the strength once again, this time before the face of Themis, to tell about all the horror she had to go through. She described in detail every episode of abuse and provided irrefutable evidence of Arcedio's guilt. Thanks to Nidia's testimony and the results of genetic examinations, the prosecutor's office managed to completely refute the defendant's absurd version of the alleged adoption. Let me remind you that Arcedio insisted to the last that Nidia was not his biological daughter, and therefore he was not guilty of incest. But all these miserable attempts to manipulate the facts were shattered against the iron evidence the girl was indeed the biological daughter of her executioner. Interestingly, during the trial, the prosecutor's office employees tried to expand the charges against Arcedio and add new episodes to the case. In particular, there were suspicions that the defendant could have committed indecent acts against one of his younger daughters, Nidia's own sisters. But unfortunately, these facts could not be proven. The girls were too withdrawn and frightened. Too deep were the scars left on their psyche by the tyrant father. The trial of Arcedio took place under conditions of incredible hype and public pressure. Representatives of the media were allowed into the courtroom literally for a few minutes and in very limited numbers. But even these fragmentary notes and reports allow us to get some idea of the course of the process. Journalists who were lucky enough to be present at the hearings said that at first Arcedio continued to deny absolutely all the charges. He behaved defiantly, raised his voice at the judge, and prosecutors accused Nidia of slander. But as more and more new testimonies about his crimes were heard at the trial, the monster's self-confidence melted away. And already closer to the end of the trial, Arcedio unexpectedly admitted his guilt on all counts of the accusation. He even dared to ask for forgiveness from his daughter and her children, begging for forgiveness and mercy. However, the sincerity of this repentance was highly doubtful. The transition from complete denial of guilt to confession of all crimes was too abrupt. So most likely we were dealing with another attempt at manipulation, and not with genuine repentance and realization of his guilt. In October 2009, the judge finally delivered a verdict in this high-profile case. Arcedio Álvarez Quintero was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 15 years and 7 months in prison. But to be honest, such a term seems simply ridiculous compared to the scale and cruelty of this bastard's crimes. Therefore, it is not surprising that both Colombian society and Nidia herself perceived this sentence as a spit in the face of justice. But even this already lenient sentence was unexpectedly reduced a few months later to 11 years and 7 months in prison. The reasons for such a strange decision remained a mystery. The authorities refused to comment on them. Some suggested that Arcedio's health had deteriorated sharply behind bars, and this allegedly became the basis for mitigating the punishment. But personally, I don't really believe in this version. After the final line was drawn under this high-profile court case, a new stage of life began for Nidia and her 6 children. By decision of the authorities, they were all transferred to social shelters in the capital of Colombia, the city of Bogotá. Officials believed that it was there, far from the places where the family had suffered so much suffering and humiliation, that they would be able to start from scratch and gradually recover from years of trauma. I cannot but note the wisdom and humanity of this decision. After all, too often victims of domestic violence, especially in small towns, are forced to continue living side by side with their abusers and indifferent witnesses to their suffering. And this, of course, does not contribute to either psychological recovery or a return to normal life. So I sincerely hope that in Bogotá, Nidia and her children were able to receive not only a roof over their heads and material assistance, but also the psychological rehabilitation they so desperately needed. Unfortunately, not all of Nidia's children were destined to start a new life with their mother. Her 2 eldest sons, who at one time decided to stay with their tyrant father, never joined the family after the trial. Their subsequent fate remains unknown. One can only guess what psychological wounds were left in their souls by living under the same roof with a psychopath and how this affected their further life choices. I really want to believe that one day these guys will still realize the horror of what their father did and find the strength to apologize to their mother and sisters. But as my experience shows, too often children who have grown up in an atmosphere of violence later become abusers themselves. I hope that Nidi's sons will be able to avoid this terrible fate. However, as it turned out later, even in such a hell as Pacalquia, Arcedio managed to show his insidiousness and cunning. In 2011, the prison administration reported the death of inmate Alvarez Quintero. According to the official version, shortly before his death, he was transferred to the prison hospital for a planned operation and blood pressure monitoring. During the operation, Arcedio's gallbladder was removed, and at first it seemed that everything had gone well. But shortly after returning to his cell, the prisoner's condition deteriorated sharply, and a few hours later he was found dead. After reviewing the autopsy report, the prison doctor concluded that death was due to natural causes, probably due to complications after surgery. But was this really the case? After all, Arcedio had repeatedly demonstrated his ability to manipulate and deceive even experienced professionals. So I personally have some doubts about this official version. Nidi had to lie for many years in terrible conditions, dreaming of freedom every day, but not having enough courage to escape. Fear of her father, his constant threats, and beatings made her a submissive victim, incapable of rebellion. But maternal love and despair proved stronger than fear, and when Nidi realized that her own daughters were already in danger, she finally dared to take a desperate step. Risking her life, this heroic woman broke free from the monster's claws and took almost all her children with her. And even after finding herself at liberty, Nidi continued to live with one desire to provide her children with a decent and happy future. She understood that years of humiliation and violence had not passed without a trace for her daughters and sons. They all needed not only material support, but also psychological rehabilitation, education, and assistance in socialization. Perhaps the most important lesson Nidi learned from her suffering was the realization of the terrible price of silence. After all, it was her years of silence and fear that allowed Arcedio to continue his crimes for so long. If Nidi had dared to tell the truth earlier, how much pain and suffering could have been avoided. I am convinced that Nidi's story should serve as a reminder to the whole of society. A reminder that violence and abuse in the family is not a private matter, but a serious crime that must be fought by all possible means. We have no right to turn away and pretend that we do not notice anything when a defenseless child or woman is suffering nearby. Each of us is responsible for ensuring that such stories never happen again. And if we are vigilant, caring, and ready to come to the aid of those in need, perhaps one day we will be able to build a society free from domestic violence.